Welcome back, Bantwana Nkosi. Now we turn to the story of the tariffs, which are expected to kick in on Friday. The United States has imposed 30% tariffs on all South African exports. I'm joined by Professor Patrick Bond, who is a political economist. Prof, welcome to Power Talk. Always a pleasure to have you here, but thanks indeed for creating time to speak to us.
Well, thanks very much for having me, Mbuyiseni, and greetings to the listeners.
We're also joined by Dr. Paulina Mamogobo, Chief Economist at the Automotive Body Council called NAAMSA. Welcome to Power Talk, Doc, and thanks for joining us.
Good morning, Doc, and thank you so much for having us this morning.
Let me start with you, Professor Bond. Just a quick summary of the background of this tariff war by the United States. What does the U.S. seek to achieve with these tariff impositions that seem obviously ridiculous?
Yes, they are, and they're partly ridiculous because the basic theory behind it doesn't really hold water. It could, potentially, if you have tariffs that then protect your local industry from excessive international competition. South Africa puts on such tariffs against the dumping of steel and tires, and AMSA is maybe advocating dumping, against dumping of cars, and so that's to keep, let's say, the pricing below the cost of production from destroying, sometimes in a predatory way. There's something called predatory pricing. So you underprice by dumping, and then you wipe out the competitors, and you can put the price up then. That's a classic technique of capitalists to gain market share. And so there is a logic to having tariffs against that. But in this case, the U.S. hasn't really argued that. They've said there's a reciprocal tariff, which is a nonsense term from them. And it really means that they're not very competitive. They don't really have the manufacturing base. They've exported it first to Mexico and then to China and then to other places. The second argument is they want more tariff revenue to try to offset their huge the deficit for the government that spends much more than it raises. And so bringing in, at this point, a few $1 billion will make a small dent, but not very much. And so that, again, the theory. And of course, the people paying for this wouldn't be really, we'll certainly lose some jobs here. There's no question about that. It's really the U.S. consumer that's getting taxed. And that's where that budget deficit offset is coming. That's why a lot of bourgeois economists, the standard, run-of-the-mill economists, are appalled. And leftists don't like it. Keynesians who would normally say, protect your local market. See, this is just a bullying imperialist tactic. And the far right, who are paleo-conservatives, who think, well, we've got to make America great again, they're just, I think, delusional in thinking that this tariff will actually bring the jobs back and resume manufacturing in the U.S.
It seems that the United States, though, has had important shifts from its original position with regards to some regions in the world, and most recently with the European Union. What maneuvers are available for South Africa to also maybe propel them to a more reasonable tariff relationship?
Well, there are none. And as you said, it's 30% as a baseline, with the exception of platinum and gold and some of the other raw materials that go into the U.S., and they've sort of carved out those as exceptions. And then there are higher tariffs for automobiles were right from the outset, and especially for steel and aluminium. We've had those in the first Trump term, and those would affect a couple of companies, ArcelorMittal on steel and BHP Billiton on aluminium, especially those are the main exporters. And they're also the main consumers of our electricity, some of these big smelters and the deep mining, and they extract wealth from South Africa and they don't reinvest. So I think actually you move the electricity into labor-intensive activities, into small businesses, into households where women have so much of a responsibility in the household. If they're working with cooking and heating, they're going to need more cheap electricity, and that's not been available. So I don't think it's necessarily a disaster, because we have a very serious problem, even in our auto industry, of a disconnect between, for example, we all need electric vehicles. We need cheap vehicles. And I'm sorry to say it to my fellow panelists, but our auto industry has been totally insensitive to the climate and to social needs for good quality, inexpensive transport, the sort you get in India. And so I think if you look at what's going to be happening on Saturday, it will hit, ironically, first and foremost, some of the areas that under AGOA had zero tariffs. And those are the Afrikaner farmers making, extremely good money out of exporting citrus and macadamia nuts, grapes, and wine. Those are the four areas that now go from 0 to 30%. And then, as you say, a baseline 30. And I think the EU got 15, and the Japanese the same, and the other four countries that have had deals out of over 180 trading partners are the Philippines and Vietnam and China and Indonesia. And the main thing, China is the big one, 45% tariff. That's the hardest hitting. But I think this is chaotic, and it's going to be based on favoritism. We're going to see things like taking in dangerous prisoners by Eswatini's favor, and then they won't have such a high tariff. It's going to be a big mess, and it shows that imperialism is out of control from the U.S. paleo-conservative variety, and that Cyril Ramaphosa, trying to fight this, is just going one by one, and the divide and conquer is working, and they're not doing anything collective, even though Ramaphosa is the head of the G20. Think about the opportunities we've had to do something collective against Trump, and still, as he said yesterday, I'm not even going to come to South Africa. He just expects to take the G20 next year. It's a real crying shame.
We also have online Economist and Director at First Source Money, Redge Nkosi. Before I go back to Dr. Paulina, Redge, do you agree with Professor Bond's analysis?
Oh, absolutely. It's important to recognize that first and foremost, there's no sound economic theory to Trump's actions. All this, I think, for me and many people, is just an act of imperialism, where they want to use trade instead of finance as a tool to destabilize and perhaps threaten those countries that are, if you want, disobedient. All right, South Africa being one, and therefore Trump wants to use any tool possible. But what worries me is that AGOA, which is an act of parliament passed by Congress, is actually threatened by some executive order. That's rather unusual, isn't it? And somehow the U.S. continues to accept all those moves, and posing lots of challenges. In South Africa, we're going to have there are macro as well as microeconomic effects as a consequence of this. And there isn't much room for South Africa to argue because, we're in a very poor state in the sense that we cannot deteriorate at all because we don't have that muscle. But even if we were, U.S. would just, because there's no sound economic theory to it, they would just do as they please to hurt anyone in their way, as it were. So we're dealing with an errant government, an errant leadership in the U.S. and perhaps elsewhere. And I think the way South Africa and indeed Cyril Ramaphosa has to do is to be very tactful and understand that diversifying must necessarily become the way forward. Even if this country, because of the concentration of economic power among Europeans who want to trade with Europe and the U.S., there's going to always to be resistance. You remember, they do resist a lot South Africans' participation in the BRICS, thinking that we should, in fact, participate or we should enjoy our relations with the U.S. But U.S. has shown that even the EU doesn't really matter. So what more with South Africa? So I think we should begin slowly to adjust our ways, not just in terms of the government going beyond the BRICS and some other countries outside that, but away from these neo-colonial institutions that we work with, including countries like the US and EU.
And Dr. Paulina, are you able to maybe give us a proper, concrete picture of the actual impact on the automotive industry? What are we looking at?
Thank you so much, Dr. Ndlozi. So important to mention is that for us as an automotive industry, the U.S. has consistently been our third largest trading partner. And I mean, actually, when we looked at our export performance, because last year we exported over 67.8% of what the vehicles that we produce actually in the domestic market. And when we looked at the markets that continue to uphold us in terms of export performance, although we declined overall by minus 2.2% in terms of exports, the U.S., actually the North Americas in particular, we had grown by 22.2%. And important to mention is that a lot of the exports in that market were driven largely by the AGOA trade regime, meaning that we were able to send to the value of 28.6 billion in terms of export revenue to that market. So you can imagine with this tariff, perhaps the question for us is not the impact, because we already have seen it. So different to the reciprocal tariffs where there was a 90-day reprieve, with us since April, we didn't have a reprieve. So we actually started seeing the impact therein. So in quarter one, we declined by 73%. And then we saw in April, we went down by 80%. In terms of exports, we went down again in May to about 85%. So overall, in the first half of the year, we declined by 75%. But the important conversation then becomes the catalytic nature of the industry. When you look at how our automotive industry is clustered, Doc, is that our automotive OEMs actually continue to anchor towns like the East London. So you can imagine the ripple effect. So for us, we do not just look at the impact in terms of vehicle manufacturing jobs or component manufacturing jobs, but we look at other entrepreneurial activity in and around the region. So I'll give you an example. Just last year, we created about 115,000 jobs, skilled jobs in the automotive value chain. And that, of course, continued to sustain over 500 jobs in the value chain. This is because each job in the automotive sector actually supports 13 to 14 other entrepreneurial activity, meaning that activity in and around East London is actually anchored by the existence or the production and the export competitiveness of this. And that's what we continue to quantify, because with this impact, we have seen Mercedes-Benz, although it is a cyclical halt of production, but you can imagine if there is not that long-term viability, then we are likely to see towns like East London becoming a ghost town. So that becomes a very important conversation for us, and over and above just one OEM, but to say the catalytic nature of the industry with these tariffs then, of course, becomes shaken from the ground up.
Are there any interactions formally between yourselves and the minister's efforts to see the tariff reductions, since even in their perspective, the automotive industry is at the center of why they have to do so?
Yes, certainly. We have been engaging with government ever since prior to the tariffs, because, of course, this wasn't the first time Trump came into power, but we had seen also in the previous instance with the agricultural sector the impact. So there were also strategies that our OEMs were continuing to take into account. But the conversation for us then has then been, because we have been benefiting from AGOA, which is a trade regime that allowed us duty-free access into the U.S. market. Of course, any tariff above zero would impact our competitiveness. But because we understand that President Trump, when he was actually imposing these tariffs, he spoke about a base tariff of 10%. We never imagined that Section 232, which he was very firm on, could actually be negotiated. But we learned now from business cases such as the UK's economic prosperity deal that they managed to negotiate a quota of about 100,000 vehicles at about a base tariff of 10%. So what part of the scenarios that we've painted towards government is that it's to say, yes, duty-free access is what we continue to drive for, and that's what was in the initial package that we submitted to the U.S. But what's the mid-range scenario that we can look at? And that would be conversations around the UK. Because important to mention, Dr. Ndlozi, is that we are not the only automotive industry in South Africa that has been impacted. So competition continues to intensify. So meaning that if we are to get anything above 10%, then already we have a market like the UK that will outcompete us. But also, if we get anything above 15%, Europe is a very big market in terms of automotive. That means that we are likely to lose competitiveness altogether in the US market. Then what does that then mean in terms of our other export markets that we continue to actually compete with?
Professor Bond, what structural reforms, maybe for something like the automotive industry, if this trade pressure continues, what structural reforms are available to maybe for recovery, for resilience? What are the options?
Well, Plan A didn't work. It was to bring racist white golfers to the Oval Office. I mean, Ernie Els saying thank you for helping us invade Angola in the wars when he was a young lad teaching generals how to play golf. Now, that sort of approach that Parks Tau epitomizes, for example, he in Parliament last September justified the ongoing export of coal from South Africa to Israel to fuel the genocide on grounds we don't want to disrupt the World Trade Organization, its non-discrimination clause. That's the obsequious and sub-imperialist approach, I would argue. I think it's a huge mistake, and Parks Tau has done the country no good by trying to bend over backwards and hoping for what Pauline was suggesting, some kind of quota on cars. It's not working. The U.S. is too racist and too vindictive, and Donald Trump just again showed it yesterday. It's useless to try to work with those guys. And Plan B would be to use BRICS, but I think we'd all recognize that China is in the same situation and dumping products everywhere. So there's no BRICS market because the disruption that Trump is causing is creating a global trade war, and we're going to get a lot of dumped Chinese products. The third plan would be to go to Africa. The African Continental Free Trade Agreement, in theory, is out there, but in practice, it's been 5 years. It's a terrible disappointment, and that's because of all of the, let's say, constipated approaches to international trade that the African governments have failed to transcend. And South Africa is one. We haven't joined the rest of the Pan-African project for new trade finance is just one example. So I think the fourth approach is the only one, and I hope Pauline would agree that her cars are terribly inappropriate for South Africa. They're luxury cars. They're petrol and diesel cars. We've got to get an auto industry that goes to the base, and we've got to stimulate local demand with what are called Keynesian measures, that is, better incomes for local folk, so that our domestic market becomes the place we go now that the U.S.'s market is closed. And starting January 1, steel and aluminium won't be going to Europe because of climate sanctions. In 2027, the same from the U.K. We've really got to look locally and change the way production occurs and go for more renewable energy and certainly boost the local demand.
Paulina?
Thank you so much, Prof. Definitely, I interestingly agree with Prof. Two very important things that he mentioned, because I think that's what then becomes, like you said, our plan B. So important to mention as well, maybe let me start here, taking one step back. Export diversification, of course, cannot be achieved overnight, but it's a conversation that we really need to start having, and especially if we're going to be talking about strategic levers that we can be able to pull, such as the African Continental Free Trade Area. So let me paint this picture. I spoke about the U.S. market, North America's upholding our export performance. Interestingly, the other market that actually upheld our export performance in 2024 was Africa, which was by 1.3% growth. And we saw a 22% growth in just the first half of the year. So it shows that there is an appetite in the African continent. But it's important to highlight that currently we actually only trade with our SADC members. So there is room to be able to leverage the AFCFTA because, like Prof said, it is on paper, but the full realization thereof then becomes another conversation. But then
is Russia an option?
In terms of exporting vehicles?
Yes.
When we look at our export regions, we do consider the European Union as a collective also, meaning that Russia is an option. This is because when we look at in our entire volumes of vehicles that we export to the European area, we export over 250,000 units, whereby in Africa, Asia Pacific, and the US, we actually export around about the region of 25,000, between 30,000 or so. But what I wanted to bring forward, Doc, is that Prof raises a very important point. How do we then stimulate local demand? Because while we are an export-driven industry, it would be very interesting as well, or what would grow our production base, is if we're also able to stimulate a market that consumes its own products. So 2025 for us becomes a crucial year in terms of our whole policy framework review, because some of the things we're trying to take into account is that we are operating in a different operational environment because our policy was actually adopted before the COVID impact, this geopolitical shift. But also we've got taxation levers that we can actually pull to be able to reduce, such as ad valorem tax, so that we stimulate the ability for us to consume the vehicles that we actually produce. The reason we are seeing the consumption of the new vehicle sales of imported vehicles is because over time, because of our non-adjusted taxation frameworks, we have created expensive vehicles, if I can put it that way. That then becomes a bit of a challenge when we start tapping into the affordability conversation. So we do have levers that we can pull, but we need not to be reactive. We need to be proactive such that we move with the pace or the rhythm of change that we find ourselves in.
Mr. Nkosi, just to conclude for us, and certainly 30 minutes is not enough, what other sectoral investments South Africa should be prioritizing, maybe in the future, to sort of have a resilience on these shocks by superpowers? I mean, today is the United States, tomorrow maybe it will be the European Union itself. So what sectoral investments are options to help us develop resilience?
Yeah, perhaps before I get there, maybe I should just reflect on your question area about structural reforms that are necessary to help us this. I think it's less of structural reforms, in my view. I do not know whether you can actually utilize structural reforms to address these issues. This is a macro issue, largely. So if you want, we need macroeconomic reforms in this country, reforms not just in this country, largely even in the region as well, perhaps even continentally, if we're going to have to change the demand structure of our economies. These macroeconomic reforms obviously entail the monetary policy and the fiscal approach that we use in South Africa and in the sub-region. To stimulate domestic demand, you really need to see a change in unemployment and the change in the manner in which we deal with matters of inflation and related issues. That will address completely, if not to a large extent, and also help us, avoid, or even, if you want, heave away the shocks that come from either Europe and the US. Now, sectorally, there are quite a number of sectors South Africa can begin to engage itself in. I think it's quite clear now that we can be moving into areas that talk to AI, usage of such, but also I think the services which Trump does not seem to engage much with are the areas which could help South Africa not only sustain itself, but also avoid, I think, the challenges that we now face today. But overall, there is no way South Africa is going to run out of this without having to change its macroeconomic framework. Okay. In my view, that is the story that South Africa has to look at. The rest, quite frankly, are issues that are not going to help us in any way, if at all. Maybe in some way, but I look at the future quite bleak unless South Africa changes the way it does its monetary, fiscal, and related policies.
Okay. Professor Patrick Bond, Dr. Paulina Mamogobo, and Redge Nkosi, thank you for joining us here on Power Talk and creating time to speak to us.
Thank you very much.
Thank you so much.
For having me.
That's it from us here on Power Talk for today. Bantwana Nkosi, please stay tuned for Power Lunch with Pabi. From us and the team here on Power Talk, Ndintanda Nonke Makhaya.